This is America, the richest country in human history. 35 years ago, this was rare, but now it's in every major American city and most minor ones. But the strange part is, America as a whole isn't getting poorer, it's getting richer. The stock market's going up, the companies are bigger, and the technology got better. So why is it that Americans can't pay for rent, food, or medical bills? Well, geopolitics is a game, and running the country is like running a team sport. When the team is pulling in the same direction, the country can make progress. The factories get built, the research gets funded, the rules get enforced, and the kids get a job. From the 1940s to 1991, Team USA mostly pulled in the same direction. World War II, win the war. Afterwards, make money rebuilding. Then, beat the Soviets. Each of those aligned the incentives of the people and required everyone to work together. However, in 1991, something unexpected happened. The Soviets walked off the board, and there was nothing left to win. The country that had spent 50 years organized around the next thing suddenly didn't have one. So the players started pulling in different directions. In 1945, America made about 50% of everything the world manufactured. Half. Steel, cars, ships, planes. If it was going to be built anywhere on the planet, it was likely built in America, on American-made machines. 80 years later, America can't even make the base ingredients for their own drugs. It can't make the chips for their own weapons. And it can't build chips fast enough to replace the ones that are falling apart. How does the country go from making half of everything to not being able to make its own medicine? It's not a mystery. It's a story about what started paying better than making stuff. In 1955, if you ran a big company, the way you made money was by making things. You built the factory, you hired the workers, you sold the product, and the stock price followed the business. But in the 1980s, the rules changed. 1982, the SEC made stock buybacks easier, and a different idea took over. What if the job of a company wasn't to build things, but to instead return value to shareholders? That makes sense, right? If I were to sell you a piece of my company, and I started devaluing that piece, you'd be pretty upset. Well, it turns out that the best strategy for returning value to shareholders wasn't to build a better factory. It was to buy back the company's own stock. In the 40 years since, American companies have spent over $10 trillion buying back their own stock, with over $1 trillion in 2025 alone. And this is money that didn't go into new factories, R&D, new products, or higher wages. It all went into making the stock price go up. Boeing is the cleanest symbol of what changed. This was once the company that helped win World War II and put a 747 in every sky on Earth. Then, it became a company that spent tens of billions of dollars buying back its own stock while its engineering culture rotted from the inside. And eventually, that rot became impossible to hide. Multiple crashes, hundreds dead, and in 2024, a door blew off mid-flight. This pattern is bigger than just Boeing. General Electric, Apple, Microsoft. Across corporate America, profits flowed increasingly into buybacks instead of factories, workers, and domestic production capacity. The lesson was simple. You didn't have to build in America to win in America. Then, 2001 happened. China joined the World Trade Organization, and American companies got access to cheap Chinese labor. Between the year 2000 and 2010, America lost over 5 million manufacturing jobs, and many companies used those savings to buy back more of their own shares. While executives and skyscrapers see their stock price climb, the people in the country see their livelihood disappear. After World War II, America did something that no other country had done at scale. It built houses for everyone. A working man with just one job could afford a home. The payment was a quarter of his paycheck. That deal is over. In 1985, the median home cost about 3 times the median household income. Today, it's over 5 times, and that's with farmer households relying on 2 incomes. The age of the first-time homebuyer was also 29 years old back then. Now, they're pushing 40. For a lot of people watching this, the house their parents bought on one job has become a fantasy. The country didn't run out of land, it didn't run out of wood, and it didn't run out of people who needed somewhere to live. It ran out of permission to build homes. Somewhere along the way, homeowners figured out that their house was probably the largest financial asset they would ever own. And one way to keep that asset valuable was to make sure no one else could build anywhere near it. So they lobbied against it.
This would be a 37% increase in population, and the density would increase to 23,000 people per square mile. This is unsustainable.
Neighborhood by neighborhood, America made it illegal to build apartments, duplexes, starter homes, and small houses, leaving only expensive homes on expensive lots. We stopped treating houses as places to raise families and started treating them as retirement funds. But most people can't afford to buy those kinds of homes with just their salary. So they started taking out larger and larger loans.
So do applicants ever get rejected?
Then, the financial crisis happened. People couldn't repay their loans and the financial system nearly collapsed. At the end of it, the government bailed out the banks. And 10 million American families lost their homes, and not one major bank executive went to prison. The bailout protected people who wrote the bad loans, and everyone else got left holding the bag. Some moved back in with their parents, some gave up on owning and having kids, and there are those who fell off the ledge and ended up on the sidewalk, or worse. The people who had a house got richer every year, and the people who didn't got locked out for a generation. Medicine in America used to be a calling. Doctors took an oath. Hospitals were nonprofit, often run by churches. Insurance companies used to be small mutual associations that existed to spread risk. The whole system ran on a single assumption, that the people inside it were trying to help and heal people. That assumption is gone. Today, Americans spend the most on healthcare and have the worst outcomes. Starting in the 1980s, every part of the system stopped being what it had been. Hospitals started consolidating into giant chains, insurance companies went public and started reporting to shareholders, and pharmaceutical companies stopped looking for cures and started looking for ways to turn their business into a subscription model. The AMA, the American Medical Association, spent a century lobbying to restrict the supply of doctors, and they kept doing it even as the population grew by 100 million. Today, America has fewer doctors per person than almost any other rich country in the world. Tens of thousands of qualified Americans apply to medical school every year and get turned away. And once medicine became a business, every actor in the system started playing for themselves. Hospitals figured out that a $40 bag of salt water could be billed for $1,000. Insurance companies figured out that the easiest way to make their quarterly numbers was to simply deny a claim and wait to see if the patient appealed. Most patients didn't. They didn't have the energy or know-how to fight a multi-billion-dollar company while they were too sick to get out of the bed. They just accepted the debt or went without treatment. Then, in the late 1990s, one company showed what the system truly permitted.
It will be an opioid medication. Less than 1% of patients taking opioids actually become addicted.
Purdue Pharma told doctors that a new opioid called Oxycontin was less addictive than other opioids. That was a lie, and they knew it. The FDA approved the label anyways. The same doctors who took that Hippocratic oath wrote those prescriptions because Purdue sales reps paid for their lunches and their conferences, and the pharmacies filled them. Purdue kicked off a crisis that would kill more than 700,000 Americans over the next 20 years. That's more dead than every American war since Vietnam combined. The Sackler family, the company's owners, made roughly $13 billion from the drug. They settled the lawsuit without admitting any wrongdoing and kept most of the money. Everybody involved was making money, and nobody had the incentive to stop it. Who knew that killing Americans could be so lucrative? And then came COVID. The CDC issued guidance regarding masks and distancing, then reversed it within weeks. The rules came first, and the evidence came after, if it came at all. They were making it up as they went. From 1975 to 2024, the number of people who had a great deal of confidence in the people running the medical system dropped from half to a quarter. When a system has a history of lying to and killing its own citizens, it's no wonder that faith in it plummets. In the story so far, every actor has had a reason. The companies chased profit, the homeowners protected their assets, and the healthcare system was billing what the market would bear. Each one was doing what the game rewarded. But there was supposed to be a referee. That's the government's job. The entire point of having one was to be the player that doesn't play for itself. It writes the rules, it enforces them, and when everyone starts playing their own game, It's supposed to pull the country back together in the same direction. But instead, the referee started playing for itself. When the US went to war with Iran, oil prices moved. There were people who knew when the strikes were coming, and they traded on it before the public knew what was happening. The same week that American troops were risking their lives in flying missions, the people briefing those missions were making money off of it. But this isn't new. Politicians from both parties have been accused for years of trading around information they received through their committees. The Stock Act, passed in 2012, tried to deal with this, but they're still doing it openly anyways because no one's stopping them. Trump said the quiet part out loud.
And he made $2.5 billion today, and he made $900 million.
But the rot doesn't just exist at the top. In Minnesota, a nonprofit called Feeding Our Future claimed to be serving meals for tens of millions of children. Many of these children and meals didn't exist. Over 2 years, the organization fraudulently received nearly $250 million from federal child nutrition programs. The state agency responsible for oversight was ignoring warning signs. In California, hospice companies enrolled living, healthy people as terminally ill to collect Medicare payments for end-of-life care. The patients weren't dying, the billing said they were, and the checks cleared. Across the country, Medicaid and Medicare fraud runs billions every year. Some of it are corporations billing for services they never provided. Others are those that figured out that the safety net could be gamed. Disability claims spike in counties where jobs have disappeared. And people are choosing to not earn more because there are actual benefit cliffs that will leave them worse off. The safety net that was supposed to be a trampoline became a hammock instead. Nobody at any level has any incentive to stop it. The agency that runs the programs get funded based on how much they spend, not how well they spend it. The politicians who oversee those agencies get no reward for catching fraud, but real punishment for cutting a program. Letting the fraud run rewards more than stopping it. And it's not just fraud where you can find the incompetence. Politicians aren't able to finish what they start. In 2008, California approved a high-speed rail line from Los Angeles to San Francisco. $33 billion. 17 years later, the train doesn't exist. The cost has tripled, and the route has been shortened. The country that built the Pentagon in 16 months can't build a train in 17 years. Not because the engineering got harder, but because every agency, every review board, every stakeholder, and every contractor figured out a new business model. The longer a project takes, the more everybody involved gets paid. And for government officials, sometimes the prize isn't just the money that they make while holding power. It's the money waiting for them after they leave. The FDA reviewer who approved that OxyContin label went on to work for Purdue. The regulators who were supposed to watch Wall Street went to work for the banks. The defense officials who awarded the contracts retired and joined the contractors. The door between public service and private profit doesn't just revolve, it spins. The government stopped doing its job. At the top, the politicians traded on the information. In the middle, the agencies stopped auditing. And at the bottom, the fraud is being allowed to run rampant. The referee didn't disappear, it joined the game. The American dream was a deal. Come here, work hard, buy a house, send your kids to college, and retire comfortably. That was the pitch. For most of the post-war period, that pitch was real enough that the marketing wrote itself. Then, the product broke. Not all at once, but one promise at a time. Starting with college, education was supposed to be the clear path up. In 1980, a year at a public university could cost about $2,000 per year in tuition. Today, it costs over $10,000, and that's the cheap option. Private universities start at around $40,000 per year. Total student debt in America is now over $1.7 trillion, more than credit card debt and more than auto loans. The universities figured out the same thing that everyone else did. The customers had no choice if they wanted an education, and the federal loan system guaranteed the money. So tuition went up every year because it could. The money went into administration, into buildings, into endowments, and into branding. The number of administrators per student doubled, the number of professors didn't. The degree stopped being a ladder and became a toll booth. You had to pay to enter the job market, and what you learned while paying mattered less and less. And what is that job market offering now? The jobs that built the American middle class were industrial, factory jobs, union jobs, jobs that paid enough for one income to support a family, a mortgage, and a pension. Those jobs have left. What nobody talked about at the time was what happens in the towns where there are no jobs. Fentanyl killed more than 70,000 Americans last year. Many of them were under 50, and most of them were in parts of the country that lost the most when the factories left. Deaths of despair, suicide, overdose, and alcohol have doubled since the Great Depression. Mortality was rising for white working-class Americans at the same time it was falling for everyone else in the developed world. This is what happens when the career part of the deal breaks. People don't riot. They die quietly in the places that the system stopped caring about. And for the people who do make it to retirement age, for most Americans under 50, the retirement that was promised doesn't exist. The pensions that built the middle class are gone, replaced by 401ks that most people can't afford to fully fund. Social Security is projected to pay reduced benefits within the next decade amidst climbing costs. The version of old age the deal promised, paid for, comfortable, and surrounded by grandkids, is becoming a thing that only the richest Americans can actually buy. Then there's the last promise, the one that your kids would do better than you did. Americans are more pessimistic about the next generation. In 2022, 72% of Americans told Pew that today's kids will grow up worse off than their parents, the highest number that Pew has ever recorded. The American dream, the promise that your life will be good if you worked hard, has been shattered. It's not just a broken promise, it's become a broken country. So the factories are gone, the housing is unaffordable, healthcare costs more than anywhere else and delivers less, the people running the country can't be trusted, and the American dream is something that the people no longer believe in. None of this happened because one person made one bad decision. It happened because millions of people made millions of rational decisions. But the decisions stop adding up. This is what every empire looks like in the years before everyone agrees it's over. The bread got expensive, the road stopped being maintained, the rulers stopped serving the public and started serving themselves, and the people at the edges stopped believing that the center had anything to offer them. None of them knew it at the time. All of them thought that they were just adjusting. But here's the thing. America has been here before. In the 1930s, a quarter of the country was out of work and the banks had collapsed. 10 years later, that same country was building half of the world's manufacturing output and winning a war in 2 oceans. In the 1970s, it looked finished again. The Vietnam War was lost, inflation was out of control, and gas lines were forming around the block. The president resigned in disgrace. 20 years later, the Soviet Union was gone, and America was the only one left standing at the top. Both times, the team pulled together again. The factories got rebuilt, the institutions got reformed, and the dream got rewritten. The country that looked finished became the most powerful thing on the planet. A country is a team sport. It only works when the players pull in the same direction. For 50 years, America pulled together because the stakes were clear. Then the stakes got blurry, and every player started pulling towards themselves. The factories can come back, the houses can get cheaper, the healthcare system can be fixed, and the dream can be rewritten. The question isn't whether or not it's possible, it's whether or not the country still has what it takes to do it. Like, subscribe, leave a comment down below, I read them all, and if you want to learn how America became the most powerful country in the world, you can check out that video here. Thanks.